Hi guys, and welcome back to my channel. The case that we're going to be looking into today is the case of Peggy Klinke. I'd just like to let you know, I mean no disrespect to anyone I'm going to talk about, I've gathered this information off the internet and compiled it into a video for educational purposes. Margaret Mary Klinke, or Peggy as she was very well known, that's how literally everyone that knew her referred to her as, and that's what I'm going to use to refer to her as in this video. She was born on the 2nd of December in 1970. She had 3 siblings and she was part of this very tightly knit sort of family. They were all really close and they just loved spending time together and things like that. They were just a very, very close family. Peggy was actually a yoga instructor, so she did these classes and she was like a very health conscious girl. And so kind of stemming from that, she decided that she wanted to become a doctor. She was initially from Poland in Ohio, and she went on to move to Albuquerque in 1998 to go to medical school so she could take her medical exams, and this was the University of New Mexico. She started the pre-med classes and everything seemed to be going really well for Peggy. She was actually said to be this really, really beautiful girl, and lots of men would actually approach her many occasions because they obviously found her attractive, and she was kind of used to that, but I don't think that she really enjoyed it in a sense, because I guess it made her a little bit insecure that obviously lots of men would approach her and they liked her for her looks and not for her, if you understand what I mean. Anyway, as she went to this university, this is where she met Patrick Lee Kennedy. He was training to be an electrical engineer. They were both older students, and she actually, when she went to her friends, she would tell them that she'd met this guy who was very helpful, he seemed really kind, and he seemed like a genuinely nice guy. And it just kind of stemmed from there, really. They started dating each other, everything was seemingly going really well. So they go out on a few dates and things like that, and after only a couple of weeks, things seemed to get quite serious quite quickly. And those people around her did worry that it was moving too fast. Her sister, Debbie, was one of those people that was worried about it. She was just looking out for her sister, she was worried how quickly things were moving. But regardless, Peggy continued to date Patrick, and at first at least, everything was going really well and they seemed really good together. He was this very intelligent man and he was of course attracted to her. Now, as I said, there were a lot of men that were attracted to her, but I guess his intelligence and things kind of drew her in a little bit more, and she really liked him. Now, from an early stage, Patrick presented some disturbing behaviour in the relationship. It was over the Christmas period and Peggy had gone to spend a few days with her family. Like I said, she'd moved away from them recently to attend medical school, and so she missed them. They were really, really close and she wanted to spend some time with them. Patrick had wanted to spend that time with her and he wasn't best pleased about it. He didn't do anything, don't get me wrong, but he just wanted to spend the time with Peggy and she wanted to spend it with her family. So she kind of just shrugged it off and just said it's only going to be a few days, and off she went. It was on New Year's Eve when they got a knock at the door, and guess who was standing there? Patrick. Her parents' house was 1,500 miles away from Albuquerque, and not only that, he'd not been invited. Peggy hadn't even told him where her parents lived, so they don't even know how he got the address. And bearing in mind, this was before you could just Google it. It wasn't around, you couldn't just do that. So he would have put some effort into actually finding this address, and he did, he found it and he travelled there. He had somehow managed to track her down because he didn't want her spending any time without him, even though they'd only been together a few months. Now, her family did welcome him in because they weren't that kind of family to just say, you're not invited, go away. So he did come in and they enjoyed it eventually, but it was just weird. Like, he wasn't invited and he turned up anyway, and she didn't even tell him where they lived, and yet he was there. It's just strange behaviour. When they came back, the pair actually began to live together. And that was when Patrick's behaviour went from sort of being kind of normal to very, very extremely abnormal. He completely changed. Peggy found that he had some guns in the house, which she didn't really like, but he said they were for protection and he was going to lock them up. Over time, as this relationship continued, Peggy's behaviour changed. Her personality changed. He was feeding on her insecurities. He always cut her down. He made her like second guess any decision she made. She would put on clothes and he would basically tell her that she wasn't going out wearing that because He didn't want anyone looking at her. He wanted her for himself, and if she wore like provocative clothes, he didn't like it. And he just did whatever he could to plant the seeds of doubt in her to make her stay with him. She literally wasn't allowed to do anything without him. He would do things like he'd call her these horrible names, and then after it, he would apologise. He'd say that he's sorry for acting this way, she would forgive him, and they would carry on. But of course, his behaviour just reverted. After a certain amount of time, he just went back to how he was before, and it was just this vicious cycle. He was also a very jealous man too. As I said, she did yoga classes, and as you know, for a yoga class, you dress in quite tight clothing. It's an exercise class. That's what everyone does. And she was the instructor, so she would also wear sort of lycra and things like that, or tight-fitting leggings, anything that would be normal for a yoga class. But he didn't like it. He didn't want anyone looking at her. He'd call her these horrible names because of it. And I believe he wanted her to stop teaching her yoga, which obviously she refused. She wasn't going to do that. Her family did ask Peggy if he had ever hurt her, but she said that he'd never laid a finger on her. All of the hurt that she felt was more emotional than physical. And she did tell them that although he hadn't touched her, it was emotionally draining for her. In 2001, Peggy was going to this wedding. He wasn't invited, and she made these plans to fly home without him. He found out and he actually cancelled her flight. He then rebooked a flight so that he could travel with her. He also cancelled her hotel reservation, booking in a different hotel where they would stay in a room together. And that would be to keep her away from her family and friends. He wanted her all to himself. He didn't want their influence in their relationship, and so he tried keeping her away as best as he could. By the time Peggy returned home, she'd realised that enough was enough. After 3 years of being in a relationship and suffering all of this abuse off this man who supposedly loved her, she just decided that she was going to end the relationship. And who could blame her? I would have left myself as well. It's just not a good relationship to be in. It was very toxic. And you want to be loved by your partner and care for each other. You don't want to be verbally abused every time you put on, I don't know, leggings or something. She just had had enough of his controlling and abusive behaviour, and she wasn't going to put up with it anymore. So whilst he was away, she began packing a few things and she moved out. He rang her up, he was very upset, and he would try and convince her to come back, but she stayed strong. And she tried to cut all ties with him. And that's when the stalking behaviour began. Peggy moved on. She found an apartment on the other side of town, and she just tried to move on with her life. He didn't want to let that happen though. He wouldn't stop calling her, and she noticed that he was also following her. At first the calls were, please can you take me back, blah blah blah, but then after that he started threatening her. She actually started to receive between 50 to 100 calls a day from him, which is excessive and ridiculous, and it must have just been horrendous to deal with. He would wait for her outside her workplace, her gym, her salon, and he would do it so that he was in sight, so that she knew he was there, which is creepy because he wanted her to know that he was watching her, and that's just freaky. Debbie tried to tell Peggy to go to the police to tell them everything they were doing, but she didn't feel like she could go to them because she didn't have any proof of anything, and it can be so difficult with stalking cases when there's no proof. It's just horrendous. While she was trying to move on, she met a man called Mark Sparks. He was 32 years old and his job was a pharmaceutical salesman. Don't get me wrong, Peggy really wasn't looking for a relationship. She just ended it with him, and he was still stalking her and sort of constantly messaging her and mithering her all the time. But he just seemed to appear in her life, and he asked her on a date and she agreed to it. They got on really well. They were so happy together. Her family and friends would say that she talked about Mark all the time, a lot more than she ever did with Patrick. And you could just tell the difference in the relationship between the two. He treated her really well. He cared for her so much, and she cared for him so much. And you could just tell it was a complete polar opposite to her last relationship. Everyone around her was really, really happy about her being with Mark, except, of course, Patrick. He found out about her having a new man in her life, and he was furious. Patrick actually went to Peggy's mother, and he was a very manipulative man. He was a smooth talker and, in a sense, had the gift of the gab, as people call it, and he convinced her to give him Mark's number, and she did. That's when he started calling Mark non-stop. he began harassing and threatening him too. It gets so bad that Peggy tells Mark that he can leave if he wants to. Kind of a get out of jail free card. Obviously, when he started this relationship, she felt like he didn't sign on for this crazy ex, so she just told him that he could leave the relationship if he wanted to, but he wouldn't. He really cared for Peggy, and he wanted to stay. And Peggy wanted him too, but she just kind of gave him that option anyway, because obviously, in her eyes, Patrick was her problem, not his. But he wouldn't. He just totally adored her, and he was going to stick with her. Peggy and her family just didn't realise how bad Patrick would become. And these calls were just getting insane. They were just kind of getting out of hand. But that was just the beginning. In spring of 2002, Patrick hid behind a bush as Peggy was walking up the street, and then he jumped out in front of her, which obviously frightened her to death. But he was holding a bunch of roses, and he had an engagement ring. He proposed to her. She obviously refused, and that just made him really, really angry. She told him to leave her alone, and that just made him super angry. She rejected him, and now she was telling him to leave her alone. And he decided that he was going to make this poster. On this poster, he put a picture of her, and he put these horrible words. He called her these horrendous names. And he said on it that she slept with all these men and to call her if they wanted to, and he put a mobile number on it. I believe he photocopied at least 300 of these. He put them everywhere. He put them in her salon. He put them outside of work. He put them in the yoga studio she works in. He just put them everywhere. He was terrorising her, and Peggy was petrified. She didn't know what else to do, and so she did finally go to the police. Again, the sad thing about these cases is that the police couldn't do anything about it. She told them about his stalking behaviour. She gave them this flyer that he'd made, and they pretty much said to her, "I'm sorry, we can't do anything, it's just a piece of paper," which, yes, it was, but the behaviour that he was displaying wasn't anything short of stalking. It was escalating, it was getting worse, and that's why I find these cases so heartbreaking, because the police can't do much very often, and it does escalate, and then there's still no proof, and then most of the time it ends in tragic circumstances, and it's horrendous. Peggy changes the number, but that doesn't stop Patrick. Trying their best to move on, they go to Florida to attend a family wedding. As they were there, Mark gets a call from his mother, and she tells him that his house is on fire. So they rush back, the fire is put out, and then they do an investigation into it, and the investigation comes back that it was arson. Straight away, they knew it was Patrick. Now, I believe they would have known as soon as they heard it was on fire. Probably, they would have probably assumed it was him anyway. But them saying it was arson kind of just solidified it. But again, they couldn't prove that it was him. Peggy was rightly terrified. She didn't know what he'd do next. He'd literally set fire to someone's house. What more was this man capable of? Although Peggy and her boyfriend told the police everything, they told them who had done it. They really, really knew that it was him. They couldn't actually link his arson to the stalking case. They told them to try and document everything. So any encounter that he was there, any sort of form of stalking that he did, everything he did, she was to write it down, and Mark would help her with that. They began documenting everything to try and build a case against it. It was clear to everyone at this point that he was certainly escalating, and this arson pushed the pair into hiding, and I can't blame them for that. They were frightened to death. They were very frustrated as well after months and months of trying to get any help. Her stalker was just still out there doing whatever he wanted to, stalking her all the more, and it was scary. As I said, she began to document everything. She kept a lot of things, like obviously the flyer and things like that. She had a few things to already put in. She wrote everything down, and in the end she ended up having over 200 pages of events of Patrick stalking, and that's just insane. These documents really, really did help to kind of build a case against Patrick. It didn't stop there though, because Patrick would also harass her family. At Thanksgiving, he called them up, and he said, "I know where she is, she'll be dead in 2 minutes." The resulting police report from this, along with the arson case and all of the 200 documented events with the death threat, eventually led to charges being filed against Patrick. He was due in court for misdemeanor stalking charges, but the court date would keep getting pushed further and further back, and in the end it was 6 or 7 months pushed back to the 24th of January. Everyone was really worried for Mark and Peggy, and he told her that she needed to leave. She needed to move to get away from Patrick whilst his court date was coming up. So she does, she moves, and she was very careful. She made sure that he hadn't followed her, she covered her tracks really well. She did everything in her power to try and make sure that he didn't find her. And Peggy was an absolute mess. And of course she would be. She had been being stalked for around 11 months at this point, and she was really worried that Patrick would find her, because he was just not giving up. The months passed by and she learned that a stalker was still trying to stalk her. A box of her photos turned up, intentionally damaged, and they went to her mother's home shortly before Christmas. The box was stamped with a California postmark, which is where she was. In early January of 2003, so this is 6 days before his trial was due, after months and months of relentless searching, Patrick finally found her. He had hired a private investigator to find her. And then I did read somewhere that he then posed as a private investigator in the town where she was located, showing people pictures of her. He eventually charmed a delivery driver, to give him Peggy's address. And he had flown from New Mexico to Chicago. At the airline counter, he checked in 2 guns, 1 handgun and 1 hunting rifle. At this point, Patrick had found a house and he went and hid in a garage, lying in wait for Peggy. When she entered a garage, he jumped out from some boxes and he duct taped her mouth and tied her hands up. He also hit her over the head with the gun. Incredibly though, she managed to free herself and she managed to escape. She ran to a neighbour's house, bleeding, calling for help, where she managed to ring 911. On this call, you can hear Peggy pleading. She says that she's got a stalker and that he's in the house and he's beating down the door. The dispatcher tells Peggy that help is on the way.
911 emergency. I have a stalker and he's here to kill me. He's going to beat me up and take me. He's in my house. 1410, number 118 is what he does. Who's there? Patrick Kennedy. He's beating me up with a gun. He's trying to break in now. Does he have a gun right now? He already beat my head. If you don't get her, he's going to kill both of us. Okay, we're on the way, ma'am. Now.
As the police are on the way, Patrick manages to break in. She hides in a bedroom with a neighbour, but he finds them both. And he tells the neighbour to get out, holding Peggy at gunpoint. Peggy is actually still on the phone to the police at this point.
Please. Stop it. Female. Please stop it. I think he's going to kill me. Is he, ma'am?
When the SWAT team arrives, he's holding her down with a gun to her head. And at this point, Peggy surrenders. She's kind of calm and she starts speaking to the officers on the other side of the door. She asks them to do 3 things for her. She said to them, tell my mother I love her. Tell my sister to name the baby after me. Tell my sister to name the baby after me. And tell my niece she'll always have a guardian angel. Patrick then shoots Peggy in the head before turning the gun on himself and shooting himself in the head. Peggy Klinke was murdered by her stalker, Patrick Kennedy, in January of 2003. It's very much believed that he had the mindset of, if I can't have her, nobody can. In the wake of Peggy's death, her family have continued to fight for her. They're fighting to help prevent anything like this happening again. And hopefully, it saves some lives spreading Peggy's story and trying to raise some awareness of these kinds of cases. A new law was put out called Peggy's Law, and it makes it illegal for anyone in California that is a known stalker to hire a private investigator to find someone, like Patrick did. They also managed to make January Stalking Awareness Month, which I find totally amazing. What her family have done in Peggy's memory is truly outstanding, and hopefully it really will help to prevent things like this happening and ending in the tragic way that this one did. I truly found this case really heartbreaking researching it. And it got me very emotional. I apologise. You can probably tell in the video it did get me quite upset, especially with the last words that she was saying. That just totally broke my heart. She tried so hard to get away from him. She did everything that she possibly could. She did everything right to try and escape this maniac. She changed her number. She went into hiding. She changed where she lived. She uprooted her entire life to move away from him. As the court date was just getting further and further away, she changed the number, she moved, she hid away. She even tried to run in the end, and it just wasn't enough. And he found her. In the end, the law really did fail her. And she ended up losing her life at the age of just 33. And it's so tragic. My heart truly goes out to Mark, her family, and friends who lost such a beautiful soul on that day. Even after 17 years, the story of Peggy Klinke is still kept alive and helps others. And her memory will always live on, and that is such a good thing. Obviously, the circumstances surrounding it were tragic, but at least she will never be forgotten. So yeah, that's the end of the case. If you guys have any suggestions you'd like me to look into, let me know and I'll look into them for you. If you've enjoyed this video, give it a big thumbs up and subscribe to my channel for similar content. Anyway guys, that's all I have today on the case of Peggy Klinke. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, bye.